The day I found a dead fish flopping in my toilet was the moment I knew the HOA had declared war. At first, I thought it was some sick prank or maybe a wildlife mishap, until I turned the kitchen tap and nothing came out but a wheeze and a dusty clank. My cattle troughs were bone dry, my tomatoes sagged like they'd been cursed, and even the dogs were eyeing the bird bath like it was sacred treasure. Confused, I stepped outside in my boots, half-tied and sleep-stiff, only to spot a crisp envelope taped to my fence post like some passive-aggressive trophy. The paper was watermarked with the HOA's seal, printed in overly cheerful font, and the message punched me square in the jaw. Water access suspended pending compliance with HOA green space regulations. Thank you for understanding. No warning. No meeting. No explanation. Just cut off, as if I was some rogue tenant squatting in a community garden instead of the legal owner of 20 acres my family had tilled since 1957. I stormed down to the HOA office like a man on a mission, dust flying off my boots with every step. The place was empty except for the scent of lemon polish and Karen Templeton's smug perfume lingering in the air. Karen, queen of the HOA and self-declared protector of suburban aesthetics, was lounging behind her desk like she ran the Department of Homeland Security. Her yard had a fountain, a koi pond, and more water than a small hotel pool. When I asked why the HOA had the authority to cut my water, she smiled like a raccoon caught in the henhouse and said, "You're still within HOA boundaries, and your yard is unkempt. The bylaws are clear." I stared at her, trying not to laugh or scream, and asked if she'd personally come and measured my shrubbery's compliance with Section 3.4.2 of the Covenant. She didn't flinch. Just handed me a brochure titled Landscaping Harmony for a Brighter Tomorrow. By the time I got home, I had a clearer picture of the game she was playing. Karen had pulled this kind of power trip before. Last year, she tried to fine me for letting my rooster crow before 8 a.m., as if livestock wore watches. Before that, she demanded I take down my antique windmill because it looked aggressive. But this was strategic. Starving a rancher of water wasn't enforcement, it was sabotage. I knew why, too. She'd been pushing to buy out the land adjacent to mine for her precious community recreation annex. My land was in her way, and she was counting on discomfort to make me sell. What she didn't count on was me being just petty enough to build my own solution out of solar panels and spite. I called my old friend Curtis, who owed me for that time in 1999 when I pulled his truck out of a ditch at midnight during a blizzard. Curtis was an off-grid guru now, installing solar arrays and rainwater systems for doomsday preppers and eco-ranchers alike. I told him what happened, and he just whistled through his teeth and said, "Well, hell, Wade. Sounds like it's time to pull the sun out of the sky and shove it down their pipes." We met that same evening in my barn and sketched out a plan on the back of a feed sack. Solar-powered pump, underground cistern, private irrigation lines. All legal. All contained within my deeded land. All off the grid. That night, with the help of 2 beers and a headlamp, we started digging. My barn became a covert ops site. Trench lines were carved into the soil under cover of darkness, pipes tucked away under innocent-looking flower beds. Every time the HOA took a drone photo or sent a complaint letter, I waved and smiled, letting them think they'd won. Meanwhile, I was building a system that would never need their pipes or politics again. Every wire we ran felt like a shot fired in a quiet revolution. 2 days in, Karen came by with her clipboard and a pair of sunglasses so large they looked government-issued. She glanced around, sniffed the air like she could detect rebellion, and asked if I was finally ready to cooperate. I said sure, and handed her a fake blueprint I'd mocked up in crayon, showing her where I planned to put in a bird bath and a few regulation-height shrubs. She nodded solemnly, clearly satisfied by the drawing I'd labeled, "For the Harmony of Nature and Neighborhood." Then she slipped back into her golf cart and drove off like she'd just defused a bomb. I didn't tell her that by the following week, my solar pump would be online, pulling clean water from the aquifer straight to my barn, my troughs, and my tomato patch. I didn't mention that I'd checked with the county and found out the HOA's water rights were leased, not owned, and that lease was about to expire. I especially didn't mention that I'd already placed a bid on the lease. Why? Because sometimes silence is the best revenge. Silence and a well-timed valve turn. The next morning, I walked my land with a cup of coffee, passing each of the newly rehydrated troughs and rows of perked-up vegetables. The air was still cool, the kind of crisp that makes you believe things might just work out after all. My solar rig sat like a crown jewel at the back of the property, humming faintly under the rising sun. I raised my mug to it, half in toast, half in disbelief that it had actually worked. No permits denied. No cease and desist. No HOA fingerprints on anything. I had power now, not just the electrical kind. The kind that comes when someone tries to choke you out and you learn how to breathe deeper. They'd cut off my water to break me. Instead, they gave me a reason to build something better, something they couldn't touch. And as I looked out across the field and saw a group of HOA board members gathering near their dried-up community garden, scratching their heads and fanning themselves in the morning heat, I smiled. The game had changed. I didn't need their water. But soon, they might need mine. Curtis showed up early the next morning with a trailer full of parts, dust rising behind him like a smoke signal of defiance. We didn't say much at first, just exchanged nods and started unloading solar panels, rolls of piping, and a custom-built pump unit that looked more like a moon lander than a water system. He'd put it together in his workshop over the weekend, and it was designed to pull directly from the underground aquifer beneath my land. Fully solar-powered. No outside grid. No connection to the HOA's controlled waterline. It was silent, efficient, and exactly the kind of setup that could drive a woman like Karen absolutely insane. We began with the placement of the panels in the back pasture, well beyond the HOA's visible range, but angled just right to catch the full arc of the sun. The trench lines had already been dug during the night runs, so all we had to do was feed the pipes through and connect them to the pump. The system would feed into a buried cistern that could hold over 10,000 gallons. More than enough to keep the livestock watered and the crops going through the dry season. The beauty of it was that everything we were doing was legal, clean, and on my own land. There was nothing they could do to touch it. I wasn't breaking any rules. I was just rewriting the game. While Curtis worked on wiring the panels, I drove out to the county courthouse to get some paperwork squared away. What I'd learned the week before still rattled around in my mind like a secret too powerful to keep. The HOA didn't own the water rights outright. They leased them through a third-party service broker who'd signed the agreement years ago when the neighborhood was first carved into plot. That lease had an expiration date, and it was coming up in less than 6 weeks. So I paid a visit to the municipal office, met with the broker directly, and politely expressed interest in bidding for the next term. He looked surprised, maybe even amused, but when I explained the situation and showed him the section of aquifer that ran exclusively beneath my land, he started nodding. It turned out that no one else had even submitted a bid yet. The HOA assumed they had automatic renewal rights, but the fine print didn't support that. I filed my application, signed the paperwork, and left with a receipt that would come to mean a whole lot more in a matter of weeks. By the time I got back to the ranch, Curtis had the first test run of the system going. Water flowed strong and steady into the storage tank, and not a drop had come from any HOA-managed source. That night, I had dinner on the porch, steak on the grill, and a grin I couldn't hide. The air smelled of mesquite and progress. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was fighting uphill. I felt like I was building something lasting. But I knew it wouldn't be long before someone noticed. Karen always had eyes on everything. Whether it was her drones, her board members, or her little army of lawn chair spies who treated my property like it was a crime scene, it was only a matter of time before someone reported back. Sure enough, 3 days later, she came marching down my drive in her oversized sun visor, clipboard in hand, heels stabbing into the gravel like she was mad at the earth itself. I met her at the gate, arms crossed, waiting for the fireworks. "I hear there's construction happening on your land," she said, squinting past me like she could see through trees. "That needs to be reviewed and approved by the HOA Planning Committee." I nodded slowly and replied, "You're absolutely right, Karen. Construction within HOA common areas needs approval. Good thing this isn't one." She narrowed her eyes. "It's still subject to neighborhood visibility standards and community aesthetic regulations." I gestured toward the pasture, where nothing was visible except blue sky and a few grazing cattle. She had nothing, and she knew it. Then she tried a different angle. "You know, if you're willing to cooperate, we could find a way to reinstate your water privileges. We're having a community event next month. If you let us use your ranch for the spring festival, we might be able to revisit the water suspension." That was the moment I knew she was nervous. Karen never negotiated. She dictated. Her offer wasn't a peace treaty, it was bait. I smiled politely, as if I was considering it. "That's a generous offer," I said. "Why don't you send me the terms in writing? I'll give it a good look." She beamed like she'd just closed a deal on a luxury condo. I watched her march back up the drive with the smugness of a cat that thought it had cornered the mouse. What she didn't realize was that I'd already planned the next move. And I wasn't the mouse in this story. Curtis and I spent the next few days reinforcing the setup, making sure everything was tucked underground or disguised as regular farm equipment. He even helped rig a small valve system that could reroute overflow into decoy tanks that looked abandoned. To any drone or inspector, it would seem like I was running a modest little well, nothing more. But behind the scenes, the tank was filling rapidly, and my crops looked like they'd been drinking bottled spring water. Then the letter came. Official HOA letterhead. Signed by Karen. Inviting me to co-host the spring festival as a sign of reconciliation and community unity. It included a clause about water access being temporarily restored for the event, pending cooperation. What she didn't know was that I'd photocopied the letter, made a few strategic edits, and had my attorney witness a version that included a new clause. One that said any damage or resource use during the event would be compensated at full commercial rates. Her signature was still there. The board never noticed the change when they approved it. I had my paper shield. I framed that document and hung it inside the barn, right next to my grandfather's saddle. Both of them meant freedom in different ways. One let me ride across the hills like I owned the world. The other guaranteed that the next time Karen tried to use my land to prop up her HOA fantasies, she'd be paying for every square inch of it. The festival was only 2 weeks away, and I had more surprises planned. But for now, I let the pump hum, the sun shine, and the grass grow a little greener on my side of the fence. The day of the spring festival arrived with more flair than sense. The HOA board had spared no expense transforming the common areas into what they imagined was a rustic wonderland. String lights dangled from rented poles, hay bales were arranged in photogenic clusters, and folding tables groaned under the weight of store-bought pies and pre-sliced watermelon. But the real centerpiece was my land, the crown jewel of the event. Karen had insisted the festival be held on my ranch to show unity with the rural side of the community. What she meant was she wanted photo ops with livestock and sunset views to pad her next HOA re-election flyer. They started arriving before noon, caravans of SUVs and golf carts, trailing behind each other like lost ducklings. The front gate creaked open with more frequency than it had in years, and a few residents even tried to pet my cows like they were props in a roadside attraction. I kept a straight face through it all, sipping iced tea under the porch overhang and nodding politely while Karen ran around in a pastel jumpsuit, trying to look both casual and in charge. The mayor showed up around 2, complete with his camera crew and a poorly tucked polo shirt. He smiled too wide and shook hands with everyone like it was an election year, even though it wasn't. Karen greeted him like she'd discovered gold on my soil. She led him around like a prized guest, giving rehearsed speeches about community values and cooperative spirit. She didn't mention the water shutoff. She didn't mention the threats or the backhanded offers. What she did mention, loudly and often, was how the HOA had graciously worked out a private agreement with me for the benefit of everyone. I nearly choked on my tea hearing that one. I stayed quiet though, because the real fun hadn't even started yet. Around mid-afternoon, just as the band was tuning up and kids were diving into the sack race with enough sugar in their veins to power a tractor, the first signs of trouble began. A few people started complaining about dry restrooms. The HOA had arranged for portable toilets, but they hadn't accounted for the heat or the crowd. Then someone noticed the sprinklers in the HOA-maintained garden area weren't running. Karen waved it off, saying the timers were just behind. But when she checked her phone to activate the smart system, nothing responded. Then someone from the board tried to use the sink in the refreshment tent. Nothing. Just a hollow gurgle. The confusion turned to murmurs, and the murmurs turned to finger-pointing. I stood quietly by my fence, watching as Karen made frantic calls, waving her clipboard like it was a magic wand that could summon water out of the sky. But nothing worked. What they didn't know was that I'd asked Curtis to quietly install a pressure cutoff valve along the old HOA line that still ran under the eastern fence. It was perfectly legal, since the line passed through my private easement. I hadn't turned it off. Nature had. A harmless but well-placed vine root had grown through the corroded pipe section over time. I just happened to notice it and let nature take its course. Sometimes revenge grows on its own. Karen was now sweating through her designer outfit, mascara starting to drift southward. The mayor looked concerned, asking if there was a backup water source. That was my cue. I stepped forward casually, just another cowboy with a helpful suggestion. I offered to give a quick tour of the solar pump system I'd installed. Just for educational purposes, I said. The mayor lit up, eager to show interest in anything green and voter-friendly. So I walked him and a small crowd out behind the barn, where the panels glistened like sunlit armor. This is my independent system, I explained, pulling open a small shed to reveal the humming pump and pressure gauges. Runs off solar power. Feeds into a buried cistern. Fully self-contained. Doesn't rely on HOA infrastructure. The mayor looked impressed. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a hornet. I continued with a smile. And the best part? I'm within my rights. No violations. All county inspected and permitted. I handed the mayor a printout from the inspector's approval, just in case he wanted a keepsake. The questions came quick. Could other residents hook into this system? Was it more efficient than the HOA's grid? Could it be scaled? Karen tried to interrupt, but no one was listening to her anymore. All eyes were on the rancher who still had running water while the HOA's festival was going down the drain. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Reality was doing the gloating for me. Someone asked if I would consider supplying water for future HOA events. I said I'd consider it, but at fair market rates with terms agreed upon in advance. No backdoor deals. No handshake. Everything on paper. That got some nods and even a few claps. Karen finally lost it. She stepped forward and shouted, "This is sabotage. You're trying to humiliate me in front of the mayor." I shook my head slowly. "No, Karen, I'm trying to survive. You shut off my water. I adapted. You wanted to use my land, and I agreed. But I didn't promise to fix your mistakes." The mayor asked her point-blank if it was true she had suspended water access to my property without a hearing. She stammered something about landscaping violations and community cohesion, but the damage was done. People started walking away, murmuring again, but this time not about dry pipes. They were questioning leadership. By the end of the evening, the festival had devolved into a mess of wilted centerpieces, overheated guests, and a board president trying to keep her wig on straight while everything else fell apart. I offered cups of cold water to a few guests who lingered behind. No charge. Just good hospitality. I even handed a glass to the mayor, who thanked me and said, "You've got quite the setup here, Mr. Callahan." We might need folks like you advising on future rural sustainability projects. I nodded and watched the sunset bleed across the field, the shadows long and soft over the pasture. Karen stood at the far edge of the property, hands on her hips, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. But I wasn't thinking about her anymore. I was thinking about the next step. I already owned the system. The water lease was almost mine. And the community? They'd seen what independence looked like. The seeds were planted. All I had to do was keep watering them. The fallout from the festival was louder than the music that had once blasted from the speakers in my field. By the next morning, half the neighborhood was talking about Karen's meltdown, and the other half was re-watching the clips someone had posted online. A teenager had caught the whole exchange on video, from Karen shouting at the mayor to the moment she accidentally sprayed herself with warm lemonade while trying to fix a busted refreshment tap. It spread faster than prairie fire in dry grass. Within days, the HOA inbox was flooded with complaints, and the whispers turned into meetings behind closed doors. Karen, of course, tried to regain control. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting and made a show of demanding accountability from anyone but herself. She claimed I had interfered with the water lines on purpose and accused me of manipulating the festival for personal gain. But the damage was already done, not by sabotage, but by her own decisions. The members who once clapped for her every word were now the ones raising their hands to question everything. Why was our water system so fragile? Why had we hosted a public event on private land with no backup plan? And why was Wade, the guy we were told was the problem, the only one who still had running water? Things got worse when Karen decided to escalate. She filed a complaint with the county inspector's office, alleging that my solar water system violated building codes. It was a desperate move, and she knew it. But she hoped that even if the system was legal, maybe some loophole or bureaucratic snag could force me to shut it down. What she didn't expect was for the inspector to take a closer look at her setup instead. The county officer who came out was a no-nonsense woman named Lynn, with a clipboard that looked like it had survived a war zone. She asked to see my permits, walked the land, inspected the cistern, and left with a thumbs up and a thank you for cooperating. But before she drove off, Lynn paused by the HOA clubhouse and noticed something strange. There was a small, hidden PVC line that had been routed from the clubhouse irrigation system to Karen's personal residence. It bypassed the HOA meters entirely. Lynn took photos, made notes, and returned the next day with a state-level audit team. What started as an inspection of my solar pump turned into a full-on investigation of the HOA's water management. The audit uncovered everything: unauthorized rerouting, unapproved renovations, funds marked for infrastructure repairs that had mysteriously vanished, a garden renovation project with an invoice from a landscaping company that didn't exist, and worst of all, a pattern of water access manipulation that disproportionately affected properties not aligned with Karen's policies. The board was stunned. The treasurer resigned first, citing stress and health issues. 2 other members followed suit. Karen tried to spin it as a political attack, calling it a witch hunt. But the facts spoke louder than her voice ever could. The audit report was shared with residents at a public meeting, where the mayor himself returned to read the findings. I sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the slow unraveling of Karen's reign. When the mayor got to the part about the siphoned water line, the entire room went silent. Then someone near the front muttered, "You mean we paid for her koi pond?" Karen stood up, red-faced, and tried to explain it away. She said the line had been installed years ago, and she didn't realize it was drawing from community water. But the receipts told a different story. Her signature was on the work order. Her name was on the checks. By the end of the meeting, a petition was circulating to remove her as president of the HOA. The next week, it passed by an overwhelming margin. Karen was forced to step down, not just from the board, but from any leadership role within the neighborhood. And just like that, The woman who once controlled the faucets of 100 homes couldn't even turn the tide on her own downfall. With Karen gone and the board in disarray, I quietly finalized my deal with the water rights broker. The lease was mine now, secured for the next 10 years with renewal options locked in. I wasn't interested in hoarding power, but I was interested in fairness. I met with a few of the more level-headed neighbors and proposed a simple solution. I'd supply water access at cost to anyone in the area who wanted off the HOA grid. No politics, no games. Just water, sun-powered and regulation-free. Some jumped at the chance. Others took longer. But the message was clear. They trusted me more than they trusted their own board. One evening, as I walked the pasture checking irrigation flow, I saw Karen's car slow roll past my property. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. But she looked. Her yard was dry. Her koi pond had been emptied by order of the new interim board. The fine for the siphoning came out of her pocket. Word was, she'd tried to contest it but couldn't afford the legal fees after resigning. I didn't smile at her misfortune. I didn't need to. The land had a funny way of balancing itself. Curtis came by that night for dinner. We grilled steaks, drank cold beers, and laughed about how a solar pump turned into a community revolution. He pointed at the humming pump station and said, "You think that thing'll hold up through summer?" I nodded. "She's built better than most of the HOA bylaws." He raised his bottle and said, "To water wars and quiet victories." I clinked my glass to his and said, "To sunlight and good timing." That night, the stars were brighter than usual. Maybe because there were fewer porch lights from Karen's side of the fence. Maybe because the air just felt lighter without all the tension that had clouded it for months. I sat on the porch long after Curtis left, listening to the faint sound of water running through the pipes beneath my land. It wasn't just water anymore. It was proof. Proof that when they tried to choke me out, I found a deeper well. Proof that silence and strategy beat noise and control every time. And above all, proof that the only power worth having is the kind that lets others thrive beside you, not beneath you. The summer rolled in like it always did, hot and heavy with the kind of heat that bakes the soil until it cracks and sends every living thing scrambling for shade. Except this year, my land didn't crack. My troughs stayed full, the vegetables stayed green, and the cattle were calm undermisters fed by a solar pump that hummed like a satisfied old dog napping in the sun. Word spread quickly through the community not just about the water but about the shift. With Karen gone and the board reshuffled, a quiet sort of peace settled over the area. People stopped whispering at fences and started waving again. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years came by asking questions about off-grid systems and how they could get one started. I never turned anyone away. If someone was willing to learn and help themselves, I was willing to share what I knew. The new interim HOA president was a retired schoolteacher named Erlene who wore denim skirts and carried a spiral notebook everywhere she went. She showed up at my gate one morning holding a pitcher of sweet tea and said she wanted to talk about a community water program. Not a mandate, not a power grab, just a plan. We sat under my porch, passed the tea back and forth, and talked logistics. She had the right idea. She wanted to offer residents the option to connect to a sustainable water source with transparent fees and maintenance shared evenly. She even suggested using part of the leftover HOA budget to fund installations for lower-income households. I agreed to help manage the setup and maintenance as long as the decisions stayed in the hands of the residents, not the board. We shook on it, and this time it felt like a real handshake, not one hiding a knife behind the back. A few weeks later, I hosted a small gathering at the ranch. Nothing fancy. Just barbecue, iced tea, and a walking tour of the solar setup. It wasn't about showing off. It was about showing people what was possible. Curtis was there too, answering questions about power storage and backup systems. Kids ran around in the grass, and folks who used to avoid eye contact with me were now asking about trench depth and pipe fittings. Progress didn't come with a bang. It came with dirt under fingernails and neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder holding PVC pipe and zip ties. By late July, the first wave of community hookups was in place. 5 houses on the east end of the neighborhood were now partially or fully running on solar-powered water systems, all built with help from volunteers and guided by Curtis and me. The HOA didn't just allow it, they promoted it. Erlene put together a monthly newsletter that included photos, updates, and even a thank you column. People started seeing the board not as a controlling force but as a support system. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That was more than anyone could say 6 months ago. Karen, meanwhile, had gone quiet. She sold her house and moved to a gated community 2 towns over, according to rumor. Some said she was trying to get on their HOA board. Others said she was done with politics entirely. I didn't much care either way. She was a storm that had passed. All that mattered now was the rebuild. I kept her old note, the one she'd taped to my fence that first day, as a reminder. It was tucked into a drawer in the barn, right beside the receipt for the aquifer lease. Every time I opened that drawer, I remembered what it felt like to be powerless, and I remembered how that feeling turned into the first shovel of dirt that started it all. The mayor paid another visit in August, this time with a few folks from the county utilities board. They were interested in studying the model we'd built and possibly adapting it for other semi-rural neighborhoods. I gave them the tour and laid out the numbers: installation costs, savings, maintenance schedules. They were impressed not just by the tech, but by the community response. People were proud of what we'd built together. There was no single hero. Just folks helping each other get out from under the thumb of mismanagement and fear. Toward the end of the month, we held a town meeting, not in the HOA clubhouse, but under the old cottonwood tree at the edge of my pasture. Chairs were set up in neat rows, and the air was warm but bearable as the sun dipped behind the hills. Erlene stood up front with her notebook, reading off the latest water use stats and future expansion ideas. Then she passed the mic to me. I wasn't one for speeches, but I figured the moment called for one. I kept it short. I told them I didn't set out to fight anyone. I just wanted to water my land without being punished for it. But sometimes when people push you too far, you've got to dig deep, sometimes literally, and find your own supply. I said what we'd done wasn't just about pipes or pump. It was about taking back control, not through revenge, but through independence. I thanked Curtis, Erlene, and every neighbor who'd shown up with a shovel or a question or just a word of encouragement. And I told them the same thing I'd been telling myself every morning since that fish flopped out of my toilet. When they cut off your supply, you build your own source. Afterward, we lit a bonfire and let the kids toast marshmallows while the adults swapped stories. The sky turned dark and quiet, except for laughter and the occasional hiss of sparks. Curtis sat beside me with a paper plate full of ribs and said, "You ever think we'd end up running a grassroots water revolution?" I chuckled and said, "I just wanted my tomatoes to stop dying." He raised his rib like a toast and grinned. Mission accomplished. That night, after everyone had gone home and the fire was down to embers, I walked the property one last time. The solar panels caught just enough moonlight to glow faintly, and the pump whispered beneath the surface, doing its job without complaint. I looked out over the land, not just at what was growing, but at what had taken root in the people around me. It wasn't revenge that made all this happen. It was resilience. And sometimes that's more powerful than anything a board or a bylaw can throw your way.